να ευχαριστήσω την κυρία Κανελοπούλου και την Οργανωτική Επιτροπή. Είναι η δεύτερη μου εμφάνιση σε αυτό το συνέδριο. Είναι η δεύτερη φορά που παρευρίσκομαι εδώ.
Are doing in focusing attention on Sparta. And I hope they continue to do this, and I would be delighted if a conference were held in Sparta, New Jersey. In the United States, we don't name any football teams after the Athenians. I have never heard of a football team, high school or college, named after Athenians. We call them Spartans. Now, the other side of that is no one names high school teams after the Achaeans. We call them Trojans, but so it is. My subject today is was there in antiquity a Spartan mirage? Prior to the French Revolution, there was hardly anyone who had a good word to say about Athens. Marchmont Needham, who wrote in the late 1640s and in the 1650s, is the only unabashed early modern admirer that I turned up when I explored the relationship between ancient and modern republicanism in Republics Ancient and Modern, and again in Against Throne and Altar. In those days, the one Greek polis thought worthy of close attention was Lacedaemon. Sparta's greatest admirer was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who at one point set out to write a history of that polis. His admiration rings out loud and clear in a passage written for the book's introduction. Here's what Rousseau says. The greatest inconvenience associated with my endeavor is that here one sees men who resemble us almost in nothing, who seem to us to be outside of nature, perhaps as much because we are in that state ourselves as because they are in fact there. Their crimes inspire in us horror. Sometimes their virtues themselves make us shiver. Because we are weak and pusillanimous in good times and in bad, everything that bears a certain character of force and vigor seems to us impossible. The incredulity that we parade is the work of our cowardice rather than that of our reason. Now, David Hume of Scotland, who was no admirer of Sparta, nonetheless thought Lacedaemon a great wonder. Ancient policy, he wrote, was violent and contrary to the more natural and usual course of things. It is well known with what peculiar laws Sparta was governed, and what a prodigy that republic is justly esteemed by everyone who has considered human nature as it has displayed itself in other nations and other ages. Were the testimonies of history less positive and circumstantial, such a government would appear a mere philosophical whim or fiction and impossible ever to be reduced to practice. It was not until the 19th century that public intellectuals such as George Grote and scholarly students of antiquity began to celebrate the virtues of Athenian democracy and to exhibit with regard to the testimony concerning Sparta the incredulity denounced by Rousseau. Politics is sometimes said to be downstream from culture, but in the scholarly world, the opposite is quite often true. A mighty blow was struck against the reputation of Lacedaemon in a 2-volume study published in 1933 and 1943 by a French scholar named François Ollier, which he entitled Le Mirage Spartiate. It was his claim that what figures like Hume and Rousseau thought they knew about ancient Lacedaemon is a distant echo of a profound distortion propagated by a series of anti-democratic upper-class intellectuals in the wake of what came to be called the Peloponnesian War. In support of this contention, he made a valiant attempt to collect and analyze all of the ancient commentary on Sparta, and he devoted chapters to the figures who proved in the long run to be especially influential. To Plato, for example, and to Aristotle, Isocrates, Xenophon, and Plutarch. There can be no doubt that in and after the 5th century, if not also before, Lacedaemon was an object of curiosity and that it inspired in many, if not all quarters, a measure of admiration, if not awe. Thucydides captures this when he describes the impact on the Greeks of the surrender in 425 of a small cohort of Spartans isolated on the little island of Sphacteria, who found themselves confronted by an overwhelming force displayed by the Athenians. Of all the events that took place in the course of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides tells us, this was the one most contrary to the expectation of the Greeks. They thought it inconceivable that a shortage of food or any other necessity could induce Lacedaemonians to hand over their arms. They expected that such men would fight on for as long as they could and die with their weapons in their hands. They were incredulous and could not believe that those who had surrendered were the equal of those who died. These Hellenes, scattered along the shores of the Mediterranean and the Euxine, were not alone in their astonishment. The Spartans themselves had trouble getting their minds around this event. And when a long-term truce was negotiated and the prisoners returned home, they were for a time treated as inferiors and denied their rights as full citizens. Thanks to the conduct of Leonidas and his bodyguard of 300 at Thermopylae, and to the performance of the Lacedaemonians under the command of Pausanias the regent at Plataea, expectations were high both at home and abroad, and there was without a doubt a Spartan mystique. This does not, however, prove Olier's case. Bravery is, after all, something worthy of admiration, and if there is a political community that has developed a regimen capable of instilling courage on a scale that staggers the imagination, that community will be held in awe, especially in a world less devoted to commerce than to war. We must never forget what Rousseau and Hume imply, that the ancient Greek polis was martial. It was not bourgeois. If Thucydides can be trusted, the prestige that the Spartans lost that day at Sphacteria, they regained 7 years later at the Battle of Mantinea. And we can be confident that the admiration accorded Lacedaemon was heightened further by the victory over the Athenians at Aegospotami in 405. There is nothing odd about the fascination with Sparta that gripped Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, Isocrates, and Aristotle. Nor is it strange that they evidenced misgivings regarding democracy. As is clear in the so-called Persian debate, Herodotus was not a man blinded by regime partisanship. He looked on with an impartial eye, and although he may well have had a regime preference, he was capable of discerning defects in every form of government. If Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, Isocrates, and Aristotle were critics of democracy, if they evidenced an admiration for Sparta, it surely had to do with Lacedaemon's victory in the Peloponnesian War. In the 10 years that separated the dispatch of the Sicilian expedition from the catastrophe at Aegospotami, Athens came apart at the seams, while Sparta maintained solidarity. How could an intelligent man who had lived through these years or grown up in their wake not have entertained misgivings concerning Athens' democracy and not have entertained a measure of admiration for Lacedaemon? It is nonetheless telling that Lacedaemon was far more often praised than imitated. This is a sign that misgivings lurked in the background, and that while there was a mystique, next to no one nourished illusions, and there was no mirage. Isocrates, who was a rhetorician and wrote model orations, I will leave to one side, for he purported to be a master of the art of persuasion. His aim was instruction in that art, and it is not easy to distinguish when what he actually believed from what he put in those orations. He was showing you what he could do. Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle are another matter. They were, like Isocrates, pedagogues of a sort, but their aim was not to teach an art of manipulation. It was to convey wisdom. And so their treatment of political regimes evidences the judicious weighing of virtues and defects that one finds in Herodotus's Persian debate. Thucydides was an Athenian. His subject, his real subject, was Athens. When Pericles, at the outset of what Thucydides calls the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, told his compatriots that they would win through, the historian believed him. The story that the latter tells in his history is an attempt to explain to himself and to others why Pericles' predictions proved wrong. By way of his narrative, he makes it clear that Athens defeated itself. As for Sparta, all that it had to do to win was to remain impassive, escape bitter domestic conflict, maintain focus and discipline, and sidestep unnecessary risks. Had the Athenians been capable of following Pericles' advice, he implies, they almost certainly would have won, but they weren't capable of doing that. It should then be no surprise that Thucydides should have little to say about Lacedaemon itself. Of course, he does allow us to see that it could produce impressive men. Apart perhaps for Alcibiades, is there anyone among the successors of Pericles who bears comparison with the Eurypontid king Archidamus, with Brasidas, or even Gylippus? Also, in his description of the Battle of Mantinea, Thucydides gives us a picture of Spartan discipline and an indication of the profound difference that that discipline could make. In a similar fashion, Thucydides provides us with information suggesting Lacedaemon's defects. The Spartans prided themselves on their sophrosune, that is, on their modesty, moderation, and good sense. In one passage, Thucydides attributes this quality to the Lacedaemonians, noting that of the Hellenes, only the Chians rivaled the Spartans in their possession of sophrosune. In another, a few paragraphs later, he indicates that each of these two communities possessed an exceptionally large servile population. What he intimates via this juxtaposition is that the modesty, moderation, and good sense evidenced by the Lacedaemonians is less a quality of character instilled in them by their upbringing and moral formation than a fragile byproduct of the fear generated at Sparta by the prospect of a servile rebellion. There are two other passages that point to his awareness that the Spartan regime is defective. At an assembly held at Lacedaemon shortly before the outbreak of the war described by Thucydides, the Athenians, in an apparent attempt to head off the struggle, issued, he reports, a warning to the Spartans. If, having eliminated us, you were to establish an empire, you would quickly squander the goodwill you secured because of the fear others entertain regarding us, particularly if you were to conduct yourself in the manner in which you conducted yourself during the short time in which you held the hegemony against the Persians. Your customs do not mix well with those of others. And when one of you goes abroad, when one of you goes abroad, he employs neither the mores of his own city nor those used by the rest of the Greeks. It would be easy to dismiss this as a partisan claim on the part of the Athenians, were it not for the fact that the subsequent history, retailed by Thucydides, bears it out. It does not matter whether Thucydides invented this passage, as many scholars no doubt suppose, or simply selected it from among the things that his compatriots had reportedly said and highlighted it here, as I believe. Either way, given the fact that he lived long enough to witness the aftermath of the war, its inclusion in his narrative is indicative of his thinking. Much the same can be said regarding the second of the two pertinent passages. In the exchange they had with the leaders of the Melians in 416, the Athenians are said to have conceded that when it came to their own interests and the nomoi prescribed within their polity, the Lacedaemonians practiced arete in a thoroughgoing manner. But they then he reportedly added that when dealing with outsiders, The Lacedaemonians are of those whom we know the most conspicuous for thinking that the pleasant is beautiful or noble, and that the advantageous is just. This too was borne out by the events that took place in the aftermath of the Spartan victory over Athens. The implication of these two passages is that Lacedaemonian virtue was a hothouse flower, and the Spartans were unfit for imperial rule. I belabor the thinking of a figure who does not loom large in Olier's argument for a reason. Plato and Aristotle are like Thucydides, nuanced in their treatment of Lacedaemon. None of these figures treats Sparta simply as an oligarchy. That claim is a figment of the late modern imagination. These two Greek writers are aware, of course, that every Greek polis was what Tocqueville would later speak of as an aristocracy of masters. If they do not dwell on the fact, it is because servitude was a universal institution. Their aim is to highlight what it is that causes one Hellenic aristocracy of masters to differ from another. And this leads them to distinguish what came to be called mixed regimes from democracies on the one hand and oligarchies on the other. Plato, in his Laws, makes much of this, in part because he believed that the mix weighed against the defect that these pure regimes displayed, and in part because it was obvious that it contributed to the civic peace and stability responsible for Lacedaemon's victory in the struggle with Athens. Aristotle is by no means averse to thinking along the same lines. These two figures recognize that there is something admirable about Lacedaemon, and they praise the Spartans first for instituting a species of paideia aimed at shaping character and instilling virtue. Neither, however, believes that the particular paideia accorded young Spartans is worthy of admiration and emulation. It is especially telling that neither Plato nor Aristotle attributes to the Lacedaemonians the sophrosune, the moderation, modesty, and good sense that they claim for themselves. Aristotle, in fact, contends that there was something beast-like about the upbringing of young Spartans. And Plato makes a comparable point when he draws attentions to the shortcomings of a polity founded on an eros for honor, both in his Republic and in his Laws. Both his Republic and his Laws ought to be read as a correction of Lacedaemonian defects. Among other things, Plato believed that the virtue of the Lacedaemonians was, in the literal sense of the word, superficial, that Spartan paideia and the honorific culture which it inspired produced men obsessed with how they appeared to their fellow Lacedaemonians, who were in fact torn between their public duties and their private wants. Such men, he observed, will long for money just as those in oligarchies do, and under the cover of darkness like savages, they will pay honor to silver and gold. The consequence was a Spartan disobedience of the law against the possession of gold and silver, so widespread and so pervasive that there was, he says, not in all of Hellas as much gold and silver as is held privately in Lacedaemon. Through many generations, it has been entering the place from every part of Greece and often from the barbarians as well, but to no other place does it ever depart. As in the fable of Aesop, what the fox said to the lion is true. The tracks left by the money going into Lacedaemon are clear, but nowhere can one see any traces of it going back out. To this result, the custom of treating a man's home as a realm truly private made a profound contribution. The Athenian philosopher speaks of the magazines for storage and domestic treasure of the Spartiates, and he mentions the walls surrounding their houses, which are exactly like private nests where they can make great expenditure on women and on whomever else they might wish. And the evidence bears out his claim that these houses were stocked with valuables. Aristotle shared Plato's judgment of what the latter, with an eye to its single-minded focus on glory and honor, termed the democratic regime. He took note of the sumptuary laws limiting the expense and specifying the character of funerals, and he was aware of the regulations governing the comportment of women and denying them the right to let their hair grow long, to wear jewelry in public, and to otherwise adorn themselves. But he thought these and other similar nomoi grossly inadequate, and he contended that the Spartan legislator had in fact mixed the love of honor with the love of money, and had therefore formed private individuals covetous of wealth. The peripatetic philosopher attributed this in part to the absence of laws regarding the household. In particular, like Plato, he faulted Spartan institutions for their failure to bring under control the women, who live intemperately in every kind of license and luxury, observing that the necessary consequence is that riches are held in honor, especially when the citizens fall under the rule of their women, as tends to happen among peoples devoted to soldiering and war. The arrangements regarding the women not only introduce an air of unseemliness into the regime, they tend to foster avarice as well. It should not then be surprising that when in the period stretching from 1965 to 1974, Eugène Napoleon Tigerstedt published a 2-volume study of the legend of Sparta in antiquity, he did not reiterate Olier's critique of Plato and Aristotle. It was his view that the chief purveyor of what he, like Ollier, took to be legend was Xenophon. That Xenophon was an ardent admirer of Lacedaemon is a view long held, and there's this to be said for it. Xenophon spent most of his life in exile from Athens as a client of the Spartans, and the encomium of his patron Agesilaus that he penned in the wake of that Eurypontid king's death is anything but critical of the man. His Hellenica, however, is something else again. It belongs to a different genre in which praise must be earned if it is to be bestowed. Just as Thucydides' history has Athens' demise as an imperial power as its subject, Xenophon's book is focused on the failure of the Spartan hegemony. And as Christopher Tuplin has recently demonstrated in detail, it is a critique of Lacedaemon, toned down, of course, but unmistakable in its character once one rereads the text with this possibility in mind. If it does not dwell on Epaminondas, the liberation of Messenia, and the like, it is not because Xenophon is concealing Sparta's defeat or cannot bring himself to face it. It is rather because Xenophon is not writing a chronicle on the Thucydidean model. It is because his Hellenica more nearly resembles a commentary on the events of his time, and because he, like Thucydides, is like Thucydides in thinking that the polity on which he has focused his attention defeated itself. In other words, he doesn't talk about Epaminondas because he thinks Sparta defeated itself. Epaminondas was secondary to that. Thucydides doesn't talk much about Sparta because he thinks Athens defeated itself. What Christopher Tuplin has done for Xenophon's Hellenica, Noreen Humble has done for his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians. That work, too, was long read as a pro-Spartan tract. In fact, however, it is a balanced account of what the regime achieved and what it failed to achieve. Tellingly, Xenophon never, ever attributes sophrosune, moderation, modesty, and good sense, to the Lacedaemonians. And it is their lack of this quality, it is the absence in the character of those produced by the laws of Lycurgus of a modesty, moderation, and good sense impervious to temptation and capable of sustaining itself in the absence of surveillance that explains the failure of the Spartan hegemony. As Humboldt demonstrates, what Xenophon has to say in the devastating penultimate chapter of the work follows naturally from what he ostentatiously refrains from saying in the preceding paragraphs. I'm aware that in earlier times, the Lacedaemonians chose to live with one another at home, having modest possessions, rather than to serve as harmos in the cities and to court corruption by subjecting themselves to flattery. I am also aware that back then they feared it being discovered that they were in possession of gold, while now there are those who actually make a display of its possession. To prevent this, I know there were back then acts dictating the expulsion of foreigners, and to travel abroad was prohibited lest the citizens ingest a species of slackness and sloth apt to eventuate in recklessness and crime. Now I know that those deemed first among them are zealous that they never cease serving as harmless in foreign parts. There was a time when they took care to be worthy of leadership. Now they exert themselves much more to exercise rule than to be worthy of doing so. Accordingly, while in former times the Hellenes would journey to Lacedaemon and ask her to lead them against those regarded as malefactors, many are now rallying with one another to prevent the Spartans from regaining dominion. There is no need to wonder why these censures are directed at them, since it is clear that they obey neither God nor the laws of Lycurgus. Xenophon describes here in retrospect what Thucydides' Athenians described in prospect. He too regarded Spartan virtue as a hothouse flower, produced in reaction to the Helot threat and enforced by surveillance. The chief Spartan magistrates are called ephors, overseers. When exported, it withered. In short, Xenophon's conclusion was that the laws of Lycurgus, when judged by their putative aim, were a dismal failure. As should be clear by now, the so-called Spartan mirage is itself a mirage, a distortion produced by the modern scholarly imagination. The only element in Ollier's argument that is still widely accepted is his claim that Plutarch was a mythmaker and that under the influence of the peripatetic Stoic authors of treatises on the Lacedaemonian regime, he misrepresented early Sparta. This argument is also unsound. First, we know next to nothing concerning these studies. Second, these works were written in the wake of Aristotle's constitution of the Lacedaemonians by his students Theophrastus of Eresus and Dicaearchus of Messana, by his epitomator Heraclides of Lembus, and by his Stoic imitator Spyrus of Borysthenes. Third, it is likely that Aristotle's treatise resembled his constitution of the Athenians and addressed the origins of the Spartan constitution, the emergence of its constituent institutions, and the history of property relations at Sparta, a subject that is being discussed at this conference. Fourth, it is to say the least most improbable that Theophrastus and Dicaearchus departed widely from the account articulated by their master. It is inconceivable that the epitomator Heracles did so, and there's no evidence that Spyrus did. It would, moreover, have been exceedingly awkward for Spyrus to have done so, given the fact that the Lacedaemonians had decreed that Dicaearchus' account be read out loud to all the citizens once a year. In short, the treatises on which Plutarch based his life of Lycurgus were either written by Aristotle or were in all likelihood faithful variations on the Aristotelian account, which is itself likely to have been tolerably accurate. To this we can add that Plutarch was a discerning reader who greatly admired Aristotle. How likely is it that he embraced an account subsequent to that of the peripatetic, which was at odds with what that great man had reported? I would suggest then that it is time to retire the phrase, the Spartan mirage, and to try once again to make sense of the evolution of Lacedaemonian institutions, including the economic and property arrangements that will be discussed in this conference, on the basis of what can be gleaned from the ancient reports and from the archaeological record. One does not have to embrace Rousseau's disdain for bourgeois society and echo his enthusiasm for the Spartans to acknowledge just how impressive they were. As David Hume's example should remind us, one can easily reject Lacedaemon as a model for human flourishing without spurning what the ancient writers had to say. If there is a Spartan mirage, it has been a byproduct of the incredulity that Rousseau so vigorously condemned. Thank you.